Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session, which is Biodiversity Net Gain, What Farmers Need to Know. Just checking you're in the right place. So I'm Helen Avery. I head up nature programmes at the Green Finance Institute. It's lovely to be here. And joined with, we're thinking what they're called earlier, there's B&G stalwarts, B&G pioneers, B&G lifers, maybe, who can sort of share their experience on biodiversity net gain. And we thought we'd talk through, opportunities, what the challenge is, how do you get started, and then leave a really good amount of time, hopefully 20 minutes, for your questions. Before we start, I thought it'd be kind of helpful just to get a understanding of who you are. Is anyone here already in a biodiversity net gain project, or are they looking? Anyone? So we've got quite a few. Anyone just sort of early on thinking about it? Right, I'm trying to memorise some of you because I might call on you throughout this just to make sure that we're speaking your language as well, and helpful to across the spectrum. I think we're going to probably high level, and I think we're going to get into the weeds a bit. So it'll be a bit of everything, hopefully. So without any more of that, I just wanted to introduce my panel. So at the far end, I'm joined by Sophia, who leads on natural capital at Solicitors Burkitt's. And then you may have seen Archie earlier. Archie Ruggles-Brise is the estate owner and manager of Spain's Hall Estate in Essex. And we're joined by Tim Coates, who is a farmer with the North East Cotswold Farmer Cluster, and until the end of today was co-founder of Roxbury Bank. And then finally, I'm joined by Glenn Anderson, who's the lead of Wendling Beck in Norfolk, a fifth-generation farmer, and also co-founder of NatCap Consultancy Swallowtail, if I'm describing it right there. So as I said, many of the panel have been engaged in B&G for 5 years plus. So hopefully we'll have lots to talk about today. So just to start then, really just a bit of a high-level question on, what are the opportunities as you see them in biodiversity net gain? I'm going to be dealing with the wind here, I can tell. So Tim, maybe you can just sort of start us off in, what's your involvement in B&G, and who does it work for? Why does it work for you?
Thanks, Helen. Quick bit of context. So farming 500 hectares, both owned and tenanted in North East Cotswolds, Oxfordshire Cotswolds, as part of the North East Cotswold Farmer Cluster. And biodiversity net gain has been part of a sort of three-pronged way of thinking about the management of the farm as a whole. So it's actually a way of thinking about the route through to land use change that has an implicit financial backing to it, i.e. there's an additional component in there which is made available as a result of the compliance market of biodiversity net gain. That gives both financial but also ecological resilience into the farming business model by thinking about the total natural capital on farm. And then that diversity of habitat and that diversity of output also really matters. So in the way I'm thinking about it is it's not land sparing, it's very much this is a different way of farming within the entire farming context. And my view on it is always that a good biodiversity net gain on farm is still part of the farmed environment. It's just a more resilient farmed environment. And that's why I think it's a very exciting opportunity for all farmers, not without its complexities. But.
So just briefly to follow up on that. So what does that look like on farm? Like, what have you got going on?
So on farm, as it happens, there's three slightly different strategies being deployed there. So three different areas. One is a arable reversion project. So moving away from very marginal arable land that probably shouldn't have been arable land back to grassland to support the increasing livestock operation we've got on farm. Then we've also got silveral pastoral re-establishment from an area that was actually scrubbed out post-war and re-establishing that area. And then we've also got a silver arable approach. So that's actually three different farming approaches as well, but also all of which are, again, enhancing the habitats that are there and therefore suitable for biodiversity, again, suitable for long-term planning, long-term land use change, but also remain productive.
Thank you. So Archie, maybe we'll come to you. The same question, really. What if you could just give us a brief explainer of what you're doing on B&G and what the opportunity is as you see it?
Yeah, so we're farming 2,000 acres in North Essex, so 830 hectares. Of that, about 500 hectares is part of the project that includes Biodiversity Net Gain. A very similar approach to Tim's, that there is a whole ecological landscape plan that we've put together, which is trying to fit the right habitats, the right land use into the right spaces. So it's kind of undoing some of those post-war arable production. We're predominantly an arable farm, or were. But we're now putting in things like the largest agroforestry nuts system in Europe. So we've put that in. That forms the backbone of our kind of agricultural production. And then the surface of the fields are being put over to large-scale countryside stewardship. So we've got about 200 hectares of stewardship. And then also kind of risk reduction, so local risk reduction for things like flood risk management, water attenuation, water quality, but also carbon sequestration, trying to improve and buffer our 80 hectares of woodland by joining them up, using kind of areas that either link or do multiple things. So, look at erosion reduction. And it's about taking a very nuanced approach. So it's about looking at it holistically. We've designed a system that works for our farm, works for where we want to be. So shifting from annual production to perennial production, for example, and then trying to fill in which funding stream, what revenue sources, including Biodiversity Net Gain, is right for which area. So the Biodiversity Net Gain component of ours is about 100 hectares, but that also includes wetland creation. It also includes beaver reintroduction. It also includes a load of arable reversion, woodland creation. So there's a whole mixture of things, but it's about finding the right solution first for the ground, rather than chasing a particular funding source.
And you made your first sale, B&G, this week?
We have, yep. So we've gone through the whole process. It's taken a little bit of time, but yeah, we're there. We've gone through the whole process now, thankfully.
And Glenn, just briefly, if you could share with us also your sort of journey in B&G and why you see it as an opportunity.
Yeah, so we're about 4.5 years into this project at Wendling Beck. Excuse me. I think the main difference is we're a collaboration. So I'm actually one of 4 farmers in that project. Overall project area is about 2,000 acres. Most of that will come out of production on some really light marginal land, so similar to Archie in some ways. We're on sand, so it kind of lends itself to that. We were very nervous about BPS going, so that was part of the catalyst for this. Was really looking to build financial resilience into the business. But as we've gone through that journey, it's become much more environmentally focused. We're also in a nutrient zone, so we are looking to stack B&G with nutrient neutrality. In our case, we will actually make the nutrient sale before we will sell B&G units. We're actually just going through a conservation covenant for B&G at the moment, which has been a slow process. We've kind of been waiting for that the responsible body guidance to come out, and then obviously the first few responsible bodies to go through. We're in a due diligence process for that at the moment, so it's taken time. We've been working quite closely with Archie for 4.5 years now, and kind of propping each other up, probably it's fair to say. So we're kind of getting to the business end of things at the moment, but it's really trying to diversify the farm business to give us more resilience in the future. And I think every farm is different. We will have a bit of an underpinning with some regen blackcurrants, which will stay in the project, and will transition primarily to a kind of a grass-based system, albeit quite a diverse mosaic of different habitats. And obviously we'll have to graze that, so we're still, in inverted commas, be farming it in some ways. But yeah, I think it's every project is different, and the application for each landowner is different. It's really about that individual context, and maybe thinking about the market demand for some of that as well.
So obviously we've heard from 3 types of farmer of how they're working with B&G, but Sophia, maybe you could sort of share with us how you're obviously working with multiple farmers. Can you give us a sense of, is there a type of farmer this works for? Who's interested?
Yes, thank you. So if I would have sat here a year ago, I probably would have said the people that are looking into biodiversity net gain and readying themselves for it are simply the large scale projects. So these these people here. But now, as I sit here this year, our clients that we have a whole range of scale of projects, and very, very small projects, 1 acre, 2 acres, all the way through to the large scale projects, like the team that you've got here today. And a whole diverse background of landowners and motivators of those landowners for entering into these schemes as well. And how are they doing it? Well, either they're seeking a provider to help them do that, so that provider will either buy the land off them, but more commonly will take a lease off the landowner, and then that provider will take the responsibility and the financial burden probably of doing all the baselining, finding the buyer of the units, and then ultimately they'll be the ones that enter into the sale documentation with that buyer of the unit. So the idea of that kind of provider-led model is it de-risks the landowner from a financial perspective, but also from a time perspective. So it's kind of commonly phrased that provider-led model is lower risk but potentially a lower reward. And then you have landowners, or we have landowners who are looking to what's been coined as self-deliver their projects. So the landowners will remain at the forefront of the project. They will take responsibility for bringing in and paying for the specialists that they need. So the ecologists at the outset, perhaps to do their baselining, then they'll perhaps bring in agents to find sellers for their units. And then, of course, their legal team and accountants as well. And that approach for landowners is known as kind of high risk financially, but from a time spent perspective, but hopefully a higher reward for landowners. And there's a kind of hybrid model, and you've got kind of definitely two examples of it here, of landowners who are looking to self-deliver in collaboration with others. And so it's a kind of a new concept in a way for landowners, that they are starting to collaborate together to be able to deliver habitats for biodiversity net gain in particular at scale. And the rewards financial returns that we're seeing anyway for that is definitely supporting that approach. So in kind of conclusion, I'm seeing all sorts of people, all sorts of scales of projects, and people are either doing it with the help of a provider or they are self-delivering.
And I'm thinking about how to phrase this and potentially losing people from the tent, but is there anyone who shouldn't be looking at this? Like, is it for everyone? Is there anyone that we can just say, don't waste your time looking at B&G?
Do you want to start with me? When it comes to biodiversity net gain, mandatory biodiversity net gain is a planning concept and a statute-based criteria. So there's a metric that's used to calculate biodiversity net gain, and it's a supply and demand marketplace on whether you as a landowner have the right area of land and also the right habitat to be able to capitalise in on biodiversity net gain. So in my opinion, yes, there's people that shouldn't be doing it, but you should find out if you should be doing it before you get very far down the line by taking the expert advice.
I think one of the things that it's worth sort of thinking about this. Sophia said that, there is a legal underpinning to this stuff, particularly for the mandatory biodiversity net gain. So if you are not comfortable having a charge on your land, which will shackle your ability to make free choices for a period of time, then you shouldn't get into this. That's because that is the baseline. You have to do this. The other thing is about permanence. So we're not entirely clear as to what happens at the end of 30 years for these biodiversity net gain agreements, and Glenn's looking at nutrient neutrality, which is even longer. If you're willing to plant a woodland, then I would say that's probably a good starting point to think about B&G, because if you can think about taking that land out of production for the same period of time you would for a woodland, then you're probably okay to look at it. If you are trying to work something more complex, like Tim and Glenn are doing, then you've got to be very confident that actually the system you're going to end up with in 30 years' time is something you can live with. Because if you're not, trying to roll it back into arable is probably going to be very difficult, if not impossible.
Thank you. Any other comments from Tim, Glenn, on who shouldn't be doing it?
I think the land type has a bit of an impact on it. So there's two sides to that coin. One is that we're in this kind of endless debate around food security versus nature and that sort of stuff. So if you're on very, very productive grade 1 land or something, there's potentially an argument that that's not the best place to put nature. But I'm not going to suggest that that's, people shouldn't take advantage of some of these markets. But there is something around actually the delivery of the habitat in that as well. So generally, particularly species-rich grasslands and things like that thrive on poorer soils. So where you have got very, very fertile soils, you might struggle to actually create those habitats in the first place. So that probably just needs some thought.
Tim, anything to add?
People who have low tolerance for risk probably should avoid it.
Low tolerance for risk, okay. So coming on to some of the, let's get to it. Let's get to the challenges of BNG, and then we'll get to how you can make a start. In terms of, just sort of practicalities, Archie, maybe you can start us off. You've done some wild things on your land. So what are sort of the practicalities of creating, maintaining these habitats? What have you learned? Was it in line with your expectations? Do you regret it at all?
So, well, it's worth saying that we definitely don't regret it. We definitely don't regret being part of this process. I think the only thing we possibly regret is not having a realistic expectation of just how long this is going to take. Being at the front end of a policy like this, it's taken a lot longer with a lot more changes, and things are still changing as well. So that's worth saying. In terms of establishing the habitats and things, we're right at the beginning of that journey, and coming out of 50 years of arable on some of our land has thrown up some not entirely unexpected, but possibly slightly larger scale problems than we'd anticipated. If you'd come around my farm last year, if there was a market for thistles and fat hen, we'd have been quids in. But that was literally the only thing you could see. So, it didn't look good at all. The irony being we've probably sprayed more glyphosate in the last 2 years than we have done in the preceding 30. But this is a hard reset of an arable system. After that, we will phase out all of that, and we will start to establish those things. But it is very, you've got to be prepared to kind of go at this quite hard to sort of stop the previous system and start it again. And that's one of the things that Biodiversity Net Gain obliges you to do. So it obliges you to flip immediately into a system. So if you want something that's a bit more transitional and a bit softer and allows you to kind of ease out of one system into another, BNG is possibly not the right tool for that. Maybe you want to be looking more at stewardship and things like that to get that transition through.
Yeah, go for it, Tim.
Can I slightly disagree? Which is there's a lot of, I'll agree on one point, which is there's a lot of upfront work before the sort of cutover point, right? And a lot of cost attached to that. But that's not the point I was going to disagree on. What I was going to disagree on is that in that, you have to think very carefully about what your habitat enhancement and management plan is going to be and describe that in meticulous detail. And a lot of the tools that will help you get to the establishment of the future habitat are, as you kind of said, could come in a can, right? But actually, there's a whole bunch of farming tools which will help establish that. And actually, you can build those into that plan, and you can have that as the early establishment part, which means actually your costs of establishment actually have a longer tail potentially than if you do the kind of hard reset that you're talking about. But it is possible.
Yeah, no, I absolutely accept that. I think the challenge that we faced is that perhaps we didn't appreciate that when we were putting together the initial system. So now the plan is much more like that. It's much more organic. It's much more using sort of cultivational techniques as opposed to stuff out of can. But unfortunately, we basically didn't really appreciate that to start with. So we got caught into this sort of slight loop.
So it's taken some time. Tim, you're slightly newer to BNG than Glenn and Archie. Is that fair?
Yeah, a couple of years behind on that. So thankfully, there was a bit more available in the public domain to plan against, which which has been helpful. But it was on sort of the first of the three, we're kind of 80% there. And by that I mean we're now at just the hard grind on the legal work.
So about 3 years.
Yeah,
okay.
3 years in.
Just a sense. So Glenn, coming to you, some reality check on costs, I think, is also something that would be helpful for people. And admittedly, maybe those costs are coming down. I don't know. Maybe you can shed some of the light on that. But what considerations do you need to factor in as a farmer?
So some of the upfront costs are quite high. So baselining, particularly when we did it, when we did our baseline in May 21, when we were on metric 2 at the time. I think we're now on 4.1. So there's been quite a lot of learning along the way. I think the known unknowns you need to factor in terms of cost, particularly potential habitat failure and things like that. I see some projects go into market or people talking about their kind of cost of delivery at quite low numbers per hectare, and I worry about some of those projects because I just think there are so many known unknowns that could cost quite a lot of money in the future. I think things like the breakdown of capital assets like fencing and things like that, you need to factor those into your long-term costing plans. There's kind of multiple things in there, the legal agreements, the monitoring. There is a ton of things in there that will kind of evolve over the process of the project. And then just the upfront costs thing, it depends how you go about it. We've tried to be quite pure in terms of the habitats that we're creating. So we're trying to use hand-collected local provenance flower seed, for example, which is about 160 times the price of Emmersgate. So it's kind of, it's expensive stuff. But then we have climate change and severe weather and that sort of thing in there. So the first year we invested about 40 grand on flower seed and then had that drought in 2022. And we're only just seeing the effects of that now. And I think it's a very long-term process. I think you need to allow some fairly hefty percentages in there for failure and things not going your way. Weed control, as Archie has alluded to, is a huge issue, particularly in the early years. We're still coming to terms with that at the moment. It's not much fun when you're looking at a 40-hectare field and you've got a scythe in your hand and kind of lots of thistles that are just about to go into seed. So you really do need to be quite agile on the management. I think that's been a big learning for us. But having those cost bases really well thought through is kind of really important. You don't want to get caught out on this because you're committed. You're taking the money up front, and the really big one is inflation. It's a 30-year agreement. When you put the compound interest into the inflationary numbers on there, it's quite scary. So make sure you've got your costs and budgets properly thought through would be my advice.
And we'll come back in a minute and maybe just get a sense of how much money you can get on B&G, whether you want to share that, I don't know, or you can just share what you've heard is outrageous and what people on average should be looking for. But while you're thinking about that, Sophia, if I can come to you, the cost considerations, maintenance, change in land use, what are the legal and tax considerations that you need to be having?
Yeah, I'm just sitting here listening to the three of you who are all very well established projects and kind of feel I want to kind of make the point to the people who are looking at going into it now. It's a very different marketplace right now to when the three people here began looking at biodiversity net gain. You were trying to ready yourselves for a marketplace that only became mandatory this year, and now people that are looking to go into it today, you very much know what the demand is, or you can get very much a better idea of what the demand for the market is. And so therefore the kind of risk perspective, I think, should be less, because especially if you're a smaller site, and I speak with a slight vested interest here because we're farmers in a very small scale as well, we're not going to do our biodiversity net gain projects unless we know we have a buyer at the other end to buy the product and the units from us. So we're in a slightly different place as newcomers to the market now. So just wanted to make that point so it wasn't all doom and gloom about be careful, be careful, be careful. The other kind of considerations, and Archie touched on this, one is when you are selling units specifically for biodiversity net gain, you as a landowner will be asked to enter into a planning agreement or a conservation covenant. And so that means you're going to sell your units to a buyer and you're going to covenant with your buyer to deliver your habitat for a pre-agreed period. But you're also going to be asked to covenant with your local planning authority the same delivery covenants or a responsible body. And so there, from a landowner perspective, it's a consideration. But I think Archie said this well, if you're not going to do anything wrong and if you are going to deliver this habitat, then it's not going to be a problem that you're covenanting to various people. But like Archie says, the local you will have a local land charge registered against your land, which will succeed and survive for that 30 years, even if your land moves hands. The other consideration that's been quite a hot topic at the moment is tax. Obviously, There's been a lot of change on that recently, but we at Burkitt's have been quite bullish to our landowners to say, actually don't let tax be the blocker necessarily that's stopping you even considering this marketplace, which a lot of people are citing that it is. One of the hot topic taxes is inheritance tax, and broadly the concern is if you take your land out of agriculture and change the use to be some kind of biodiversity net gain habitat, does that mean you can't any longer claim the reliefs for inheritance tax that you were looking at before? And the answer to that will depend on what the new habitat is going to look like, what you're going to be doing on there. But equally, what we'll say is it's worth speaking to your accountants in particular, but also perhaps your lawyers, because it will all depend on what your current tax setup is for succession planning purposes. And actually changing your use. And remember, some of you are only thinking about very small areas. Changing your use to a biodiverse habitat may not impact your inheritance tax planning at all. So just wanted to put that out there. The other tax that or piece that people are talking about a lot is how the money that you're going to receive hopefully from the sale of these units, how it's going to be treated. Will it be capital or will it be income? There's slightly different tax treatments for each of those. And our response to that is, if you get your accountants in particular involved very early in the process with your negotiators when they're negotiating these deals, you can not I don't mean manipulate in a kind of illegal way, but you can structure deals so that the tax positions are as you would want them for your own planning potentially. But the answer to that question is probably in every instance it's going to be part capital and part income. And that'll do.
That's a lot of advice. So thank you very much. That was great. Also, I didn't know you farmed, so I'm sorry we didn't lead with that
on a very small scale.
Well, tell us a little bit about that, so people can relate. What do you farm?
So we're based in South Norfolk, and historically my father was a farmer. He passed away, but my brother and I are kind of these kind of new generation farmers, with neither of us having any kind of knowledge of farming, looking at ways in which we can future-proof our business. And biodiversity net gain is one of those areas that we're looking at. So I've got a whole bunch of questions here that just listening to everyone talk. But Tim, just to wrap this sort of round up and then maybe come on to these questions, what else do we need to consider? So we need to consider in terms of sort of, because it's a long-term agreement, in sort of things like, how does it impact with lenders, for example? Does it? We had conversations about land value earlier.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely can. And as someone said earlier, it might not have been you, it might not have been Glenn, but someone on that panel said earlier, can't remember who, the question on impact on land values is an uncertain one. Again, is going to be context specific, and which will draw on some of what Sophia's just been talking about as part of that consideration. How that does play out does have an impact onto other types of agreements that you might have, including charges that may be held against land mortgages, for example. So if existing lending agreements or new lending agreements may also have impacts in relation to insurance as well. And in fact, the insurance market here is something that is growing, to speak about all of the kind of long-term risks that Glenn's alluded to. So it does play into that, I think, is the short answer of that. At the same time, because even though there's been some concerns raised here, I think there is a place for biodiversity net gain in most farming businesses in some context or another. And that inherently is resiliency, both financially and ecologically, which is a good thing from a lender who may be lending out on a 25-year plus arrangement. So there's both two sides of the coin.
Were you going to add something, Archie?
Yeah, it was just to say that it's picking up Tim's point. It's about financial and ecological resilience. If you can come up with a plan that delivers both of those things, and biodiversity net gain is a component in that plan, then you are going to be more resilient. And I think as time moves on, the lenders will start to be able to recognise that. Red Book valuations through the charter surveyor industry may well start to pick that up. And then we're not quite there yet, but even if the only thing you're doing is trying to reduce the amount of soil you're losing, the amount of nutrients you're losing by implementing some of these measures, then that's going to be a good thing for your farm and for the wider environment.
So I've got a couple of questions that came to my mind just hearing you speak, and one was about demand. Like, is there demand? Is it like, how do you find out whether you've got demand? Because I sort of hear different things, that it depends on where you are, but also there's more supply and demand. We keep hearing these things. And then also we'll come back to this question of how much you're going to make.
So it's early days in the market, and the planning system is quite slow. So obviously mandatory net gain only came into place 12th of February. We're only just starting to see the first kind of inklings of interest in units. There's a few being sold. Archie's just sold a few. We've got sort of 4 or 5 inquiries on the books at the moment, which is why we're trying to get the legal agreements in place. You need to be on the digital register as well, which is probably worth noting as well, that DEFRA has a digital register that you need to be on to be able to actually sell the units as well. So, the capacity for demand is limited. That's fair to say. To what extent it's limited, I'm not sure we really know yet. But that's driven by a number of factors. One of them is how developers can offset their environmental footprint within the red line boundary of their development site. So if they can deliver 80% of their net gain on site, that obviously reduces the capacity in the rest of the market for BNG credits through farms and habitat banks and so forth. So that's really something that will emerge over time. I think it's fair to say that if you're in a very high growth area where there's lots of development, you're going to stand more chance of selling more units than if you're in a kind of stuck out in the middle of nowhere. And there are obviously a lot of farms that are stuck out in the middle of nowhere. That's what makes up the whole of the rural sector. So I think that's the first place to look, is really understanding your own farm or project's parameters. Within Biodiversity Net Gain, it's probably worth pointing out that it's your local planning authority. You have this kind of spatial risk multiplier, which limits the ability to sell beyond your kind of locality, and it becomes very expensive for developers to buy from further afield. So if you're in an area within your local planning authority or your national character area, and the national character area is often very different shape to the local planning authority, that's what you need to be looking at to understand what your demand is. If you can go kind of one national character area away or one local planning authority away, but if that limits projects that are potentially on the coast, for example, that kind of we've seen this on projects already where the sea kind of forms a natural barrier and it limits their market quite extensively. So just understand your position and understand where you are in that side of things.
Tim?
Yeah, just to give us sort of put some numbers on some of that. So in the cluster area in our landscape recovery project, which BNG forms a part of how we've approached that now, we're very fortunate to be in mostly in Oxfordshire and have the University of Oxford sitting slap bang in the middle there, who've done a lot of research into this, including what might be the market demand to the end of the decade, which can be projected out of local plans and plans out of the development sector. And our project, if we were to entirely rely on Biodiversity Net Gain, we would oversupply Oxfordshire by a factor of 100%. Wow. Right? So in terms of what's projected needed by the end of the decade. So that's clearly not going to happen. I've also probably spent more time than I ever thought I would talking to developers over the last few years to try and understand their thinking, and I won't name any names, but some major players in that. I asked a very pointed question in a kind of closed door session a few weeks ago, which was, if the policy changed and it wasn't 10%, what number would make your guys all sit up? And the answer was 110%.
Wow.
At that point. So they believe that they can, within the on-site red line boundary, that is a tolerable level. So there is a large potential that the demand may not materialise. Now, I think it's too early to say that, as in it's going to be so hyper-local context specific, as well as Glenn's been alluding to. But I don't think we should suddenly think that there's going to be this huge surge of demand.
And even when it expands out beyond property development to next year,
that is. So when national infrastructure comes into play as of next year, yes, I think that will change, because it's much harder for those to be able to achieve what they need within their red line boundary. So I'm looking forward to that development. But again, it's not really been well modelled out what that's going to do.
Were you going to say something, Glenn?
I was actually going to ask Sophia a question on that, because I've heard of a couple of examples where with infrastructure projects, DCO projects at the moment that have got either a voluntary net gain or something in there, that they're actually using the DCO process to purchase land for the biodiversity net gain. And I know a couple of examples of where that's happened. So that's a nasty question, isn't it? But
it's a really specific and nasty question. You know it. I'm going to answer two questions that you raised there. A question that you didn't ask firstly, and that's that you commented on voluntary net gain. And a lot of people, large-scale developers, large-scale infrastructure projects, they are offering through to help them get projects put through. They're saying, yes, there's this biodiversity net gain requirement, but we're going to offer it, in addition and above. So we're going to put in there some voluntary net gain as well. And Glenn is absolutely right. There is some controversy at the moment on whether some large-scale infrastructure projects or people making large-scale applications through the DCO process, so the development consent order process. These are where they go straight through to the planning inspectorate at a national level because they're large infrastructure projects. Can they use those compulsory purchase powers to purchase land for their biodiversity net gain requirements? And then we've heard sneaky rumours that they're then selling on excess biodiversity net gain units, looking to anyway, onto third parties. And we know that the CLA are being quite vocal in that at the moment, and hopefully we'll have clarity on that soon because that doesn't quite seem fair. Thanks, Glenn.
And on this point of how much might you expect, is it, just because obviously people think, I remember coming a couple of years ago and it was like, it's going to be a gold rush. And then once you factor 30 years and the upfront costs, it becomes less of a gold rush. Shall I put it that way? Anyone want to take a stab at...
They've left me
I didn't want to
hanging
make
here,
him give away how much is just being given.
I think I'm going to slightly politician this answer by saying I think we're still in a period of price discovery. So we are we know what it will cost us to deliver, and that's the important point for us. So if we can secure over and above that, then we'll go for it. If we can't, then we won't do a biodiversity net gain deal on those things. We won't enter into this and run the risk of losing money over 30 years. So I think that the weasel answer to this is make sure that you've got your costings solid and you understand them and you're confident in them, and then use that as your pricing. Don't look at the headline figures that are out there and go, well, hey, this is great, because there are significant costs, as you've heard. This isn't a solar PV deal where it's a index linked rental thing with virtually no risk to the landowner. You've got to do stuff to do this, and that comes at a cost. So yeah,
there is a bit of guidance. So you can look at the statutory credit pricing. That's one option. I think that is from my calculations is about 40% over what they deem the market value. So, but it does depend on the habitat type as well. So each habitat type will cost the landowner different amounts of money to deliver. If you look at riverine, for example, very, very expensive, delivers practically no units. They're very expensive within statutory credits. So yeah, I mean, I think most people kind of recognise that the market average is sort of around 30 grand a unit, somewhere around that. But it depends. Supply and demand will dictate, and yeah, habitat type will dictate.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Ken. Tim, is there anything you wanted to come in on?
I think it just takes it back to quite a high-level principle here, which is I don't think this is ever going to be a windfall for anyone. And I think that's why, in some of the comments we were saying at the beginning of the session, it has to really suit the farming context of what's going on. It can't be seen as something, even though the payments are kind of being dressed up as, oh great, there's this one upfront lump payment, and if you're trading at 25k, which was DEFRA's original price guidance, and you've got 50 units, well great, here's just $1.25 million, isn't it? Yeah. That's just completely the wrong way to look at it.
Also, I think when we've touched on demand, and Sophia, you mentioned voluntary biodiversity net gain. I mean, if there's questions on it, we can go into it. But that to me also feels like people are being sold something that doesn't quite exist yet. In terms of, we don't, like, just talking from a GFI perspective, we don't see any demand drivers for companies to buy voluntary credit units at the moment. Maybe through like a corporate social responsibility play or so donation. It's a way of sort of saying, well, we've used a DEFRA metric, so we know it kicks the tyres on delivering biodiversity uplift, but that's still quite a small portion. Would anyone disagree with that? Because I'm keen, right?
it's an addendum, which is there's quite a lot of talk in that space around that's the bare minimum, but then you need some more. So, for example, what do I mean by that? It's not great, that's the habitat, but we'd also like indicators on, say, certain species, and that all has to be bundled up together for that kind of a transaction to happen.
We don't have that yet. So before we go to Q&A, so we've got lots of time for Q&A, which is fantastic. Maybe briefly, we could just touch on, what do farmers need to know, but what would your advice be on getting started for those who put their hands up and they're just sort of considering this at the moment? Just sort of brief tips.
Baseline early would be the first one. So get your baselining in place, and farmers generally know the land better than anybody else. So my advice would be to work with the land. Look at the historic baseline as well. What did the land used to be? Where were the heaths? Where were the old ponds? Where were the connective woodland belts? Nature will want to try and do what it wants to do, and obviously we're as farmers, we're kind of used to fighting against nature all the time. It's much easier to deliver this stuff working with habitats that want to go in that direction, and I think that will save cost in the long run as well. So that would be my tip.
Thanks, Ian. Tim?
Completely support that, and just to add, it's all of those other bits of what might not be considered baseline data. It's not the ecological baseline through the metric. It's all of those other pieces of data, previous condition, but also everything from previous soil condition, etc., previous farming practices, etc. But then it's back to putting it within its whole farm context and whole farm planning, and I think that's the important way to approach it rather than in isolation.
Yeah, just to add that and sort of take it kind of slightly off farm. If you're thinking about this, then if you have the opportunity to open a dialogue with your local authority, because if you're looking at doing this, you need to have some insight as to whether they're going to be supportive. Are they going to help you on this journey? Are they going to hinder you on their journey? Are they totally disinterested? Do they have any idea of what demand might be? All of those things, in the same way that if you were starting up a new food enterprise, you'd go and do some market research. So I'd add that to all of the things that have already been said.
I wouldn't really add anything extra than to surround yourself by people that know what they're doing, by your experts.
Good lawyers.
Excellent lawyers.
So we're going for questions, but I'm keen before we put hands up. I'm interested if we've made people feel like Biodiversity Net Gain more interesting for them now or less interesting for them now. So who now coming in feels like Biodiversity Net Gain a bit more interesting for them now to look at? Two. And how many have we put off? Anyone feel less interesting now? Okay, that's not too bad. It's still about 15. Okay. And then there's a lot of people who are just, why are you here? The other one's just out of interest. But, so any questions while we're here? And we can take sort of basics and in the weeds. So I was in quite a lot, so we'll try and get around them as much as we can. You're at the front, so I think you should go first.
Archie, I won't ask you who bought it and at what price, but I will ask you what category the buyer was, how long it took, and how many units.
So it was between 5 and 10 units. The category buyer is a commercial developer, and it's taken us 17 months.
Excellent question, excellent answer. Fantastic, we'll get around these. Is there a woman here over by the pole? Oh, would you mind just waiting for the microphone? Sorry.
Hi, got lots of questions, but I'll try and limit them to just two. The first one is, I did a webinar the other day with Plymouth City Council. I live and farm 500 acres just on the north side of Plymouth, so I'm well placed for a lot of sprawling development. So I've been really keen to find out more about BNG. Plymouth City Council said in the webinar that they were going to do their own BNG and that they'd got 3 sites that they were proposing. I just wondered what your thoughts were on how that might impact the way the local authority talked to me about, how open they were for giving me information. And also they said they were going to roll that out to other councils across the village, and they saw themselves as pioneers.
They want to take that one. I appreciate you might not know the ins and outs of Plymouth County Council's plans, but...
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
They're not necessarily pioneers because there are others that are quite a long way down the road of looking at their own biodiversity net gain solutions from a local planning-led concept. It's a really interesting legal concept on whether a local planning authority or local authority can deliver and covenant with themselves, in essence, to deliver biodiversity net gain. And I don't think that anyone's actually answered that question yet. We've been involved in various different, we have a kind of lock-away session next week on it. So it'll be a very interesting watch this space on whether local authorities can offer the solution from a legal perspective. So, but if they can, and if they do have all these lands, the other point to mention is it's very unlikely that they're going to have unoccupied lands. There's likely to be tenants on the land that they're thinking of offering up for biodiversity net gain. And so that in itself raises another interesting quandary, and that those tenants will need to be on side in terms of needing to be able to agree in some form or another either to vacate or to be included in the biodiversity net gain scheme. So that's all I can comment.
Thank you. Great. Okay, we'll take another one. There's I can see this one at the front. I'll come back. Is a gentleman in a red?
Hi. I had a question about climate change. Obviously, 30 years is a long time. What if 15 years down the line, I mean, obviously, we're not here yet, but what if 15 years down the line, there's some climate event or that makes basically that uplift that had been agreed on impossible to maintain? Is there insurance? Has that been discussed at all?
That's great. Yeah, Glenn?
So we're not totally clear on the force majeure clauses at the moment. So, and obviously climate impact or fire or whatever it might be, I know there are certainly NFU Mutual are looking at a product for this. There's specialist insurers like Kita as well that are kind of looking at these things. There is a little bit of guidance, but we do need a bit more from DEFRA to say what happens. I think just generally in terms of climate change, it's something that probably needs considering at the outset as well. So as you're delivering habitats and kind of you get to kind of select tree species and things like that, we probably need to be thinking about climate resilience within that process as well. So do we want to be thinking about more Mediterranean species that are going to adapt to climate much better? Do we want to be creating habitats excuse me, that potentially support climate refugees migrating further north as well? So I think there's probably a bit of habitat suitability modelling that could be done at kind of an academic level to support the process of nature recovery generally.
Tim, were you going to come in there?
Yeah, just to add another insurer into the mix, which is Howdens, who are also looking at this in a lot of depth and trying to make sure there's appropriate insurance products against that, but also as part of that to do a lot of the work on the scenario planning. And we've been working with them to look at that on large areas and look at the likely scenarios that play out over 10, 20, 30 years and what the likely physical risks from climate change will be over that period, such that you can start to plan better in the way that Glenn's been describing. So there is work afoot in the sector on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. I haven't taken one for over here, so I promised you one, didn't I? The gentleman at the front in the black. Sorry to make you run around. I'll try and group people.
Thank you all for doing this discussion. I've heard some differing advice or information the last few days about when exactly the timestamp on the baseline starts. Is it once you've done the survey, done the report, filled in the metric, then you can start managing and accruing years in advance if you don't sell straight away, or is it once you've registered with Natural England?
It's when you've done your baseline. So once that baseline's done, and you need to make sure that that's done by a competent person or a good ecologist. But yeah, that's when the clock starts ticking from that point. And then there is a temporal multiplier within the metric that will reward you. It's changed slightly in the new metric, the statutory metric. They changed the timing slightly, so it's now 5 years is the big kind of kicker point where the unit uplift increases significantly. It was just a year, but they've changed that.
Thank you. well, I won't make you run. There's a woman here in the yellow or green. I'm colourblind, so.
Hi, thank you. Ellen Francis from Quay Hall on the edge of Cambridge. I can't believe you swerved the question on the money that was coming in, but we'll see if maybe Sophia will swerve the question on the costs. We're at a stage where we've got a small BNG project that has been pilot funded by the Wildlife Trust. So we've got a good understanding of what our management delivery and all of that will be. Obviously, we think we might have demand, although you've made me a little bit nervous on the edge of Cambridge with all the development that's going on. We're wondering now whether we pay now to put all of the sort of agreements in place so that we've got an oven-ready deal for any developer that comes through the door. Can you give us a guidance on maybe what the legal costs are, Sophia, or for perhaps Archie, who has just gone through it, what kind of budget should we be thinking about if we want to go ahead and fund that up front? Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It's a good question because when you're looking at this from a landowner perspective, you can choose to kind of de-risk yourself from a financial perspective by right from the outset, getting a provider on board that will hopefully pay all your legals, pay all your baseline costs, pay all your agency fees to find the buyer, and you as a landowner can sit there probably and not have to forego much financial burden yourself at all. But those that want to self-deliver the projects, I mean, the people here have done a lot of exercise to ready their sites, so they will get their planning agreements in place or their conservation covenants in place to be able to be oven ready to literally go to the market and say, we can do this tomorrow if you want, you can buy your unit tomorrow. And the costs of that will depend on, just dodging the question slightly, will depend on how big the site is and how many buyers you have. But, broadly, if you do a deal with a buyer to sell some units to get you oven ready from a legal perspective, you're probably looking in the region of 10,000 plus VAT. I mean, there's a huge variety, and happy to talk afterwards on specifics, but it's probably somewhere around there. All right.
I'm not going to get away without answering this one. Sophia's used all my usual caveats. It really depends on how much. I think the other thing to say is that because this is the first one we've done, it's the first one the local authority's done, it's the first one our legal team have done. So I think I'm not going to share the cost of what it actually cost us because I'm not sure they're actually representative, but it was more than what Sophia said. And that was split between us and the developer. So, that's giving her a bit of room to kind of negotiate with you. But yeah, it's not insignificant. I would say it very much depends on scale. So if you're dealing with an inquiry that is sort of, sub 1 unit, which is not uncommon, then you're largely going to be looking at the same incremental costs as you would do if you were doing 10, 20, 50 units. So that's something also to consider.
Can I just add, because I know exactly where your site is, I think, and impartial advice, but I would get on with that. You won't have any problems selling those units there.
And here's the lawyer who can help you do this right now.
I'll have my terms of engagement ready in a moment.
There's a hand here in the middle, a woman with sunglasses.
Hi, I've got a bit of an interest because we're ecologists. Can I ask you about monitoring? What technologies would you use and how are you going to carry on with the same quality of monitoring through the whole 30-year project?
Great question.
So I'm happy to pick that one up. We've got an in-house ecologist. So one of the ways we've de-risked this as being a provider is we've actually brought that skill set in-house. That's helped us do the baselining. It's helped us we are doing regular both species and habitats monitoring in the kind of traditional way. We're also using a mixture of remote sensing. We're using a mixture of sort of bioacoustics, which I know we spoke about earlier. We're doing eDNA. We've got running sensors in the landscape, looking at things like water flow. So we're doing a lot of monitoring that's over and above what you would do for a standard BNG deal. But we feel that because our system is quite complicated and we're trying to do a load of other stuff, it all adds context to the resilience and the effectiveness of the BNG site itself, because it's all surrounded by this stuff. But I think, strictly speaking, from a BNG perspective, it's a periodic reassessment, sort of standard kind of on the ground ecologists going around doing quadrat surveys and things like that. I think that's the entry point for BNG monitoring.
Anyone want to add to that?
To add to that, I think, again, think of the whole farm context, right? Which is, yes, they may have a BNG site within a whole farm context, but actually think about the economies of scale that you can get by having regular ecology surveys in against that, and additional tools like Archie's been describing as well, because that also opens up the route to potential other natural capital markets as well.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, we do this across all of our stewardship and our woodlands and the wetlands as well. So, it's not, BNG isn't carrying the whole cost of this as well. So that's something to think about.
I'd also just add, you kind of want to know what's happening. So you do monitor this yourself quite, day to day. You really need to understand what's happening on the ground. So I think what we're finding is it's a constant monitoring process, and we're also using the tech that Archie was talking about, but mainly because we want to understand what's happening in the landscape. All right, we're doing all these things. There's a minimum standard that we have to report on, but we also want to know what's a biodiversity uplift doing to your soil carbon or your above ground carbon. What's it doing on a species basis? What species have we got coming in there? That's just kind of an interesting thing to know as much as anything.
But it also, I mean, there's also the thinking about, most of the monitoring built into BNG deals is around habitats. So it's around the makeup of that habitat. It doesn't specifically ask for species, but actually, I think we're all coming at this from a kind of functional landscape perspective. So you actually want to know what is using your land and how effective is it. And without measuring that and without being on the ground, it's quite hard to do that. You can use tech to assist, but at some point you do still need to also go down and have a look at it.
So we'll take one more question. There's a gentleman here who's straight up, so we'll go for him in the middle. I don't know if you can see. Keep waving, sir.
Two things very quickly. Can you, for those of us who are more ignorant, can you tell us what 1 unit amounts to? And secondly, if you're in an area where there's a lot of military land or even national trust land, are they competitors in the market?
Interesting question.
Okay, so I'm afraid, like everything with BNG, 1 unit, it depends. It depends what you're starting with, and it depends what target habitat you're doing. So, I mean, in our system, we've got a range of, I think it's about 4 units per hectare up to 20 units per hectare. And it depends, and the higher end of that are the much harder habitats to achieve. There's a reason the metric rewards doing that. So but I think that's probably a reasonable kind of. But yeah, we're Glenn's saying we've budgeted on the bottom end. We haven't budgeted on any of the higher end ones, but that's your range.
So just on the National Trust and the MOD, I'm not quite sure where the National Trust are on their policy. I think they're nervous about reputational risk from the developments they might be supporting, but there's probably something on their website that I think I'm actually on the advisory board of my local church, so I should probably know that. But but I mean the MOD we have had one conversation with the MOD, and I think that they actually have quite a big requirement themselves. So you might find that if they are doing stuff, they're actually using that BNG for their own uses. But I guess time will tell on both of those.
I can comment on the National Trust actually, because we do know that this is public information. They are involved with 2 landscape recovery projects that I know of, one in the southwest, and actually I think they're both in the southwest. So those landscape recovery projects aren't obviously just aimed at biodiversity net gain, but it does mean they're opening their doors for natural capital opportunities as a whole. And one of them they're sole delivering, they're the sole landowner in it. And so on that basis, they all are obviously thinking about natural capital as a whole, but whether, like Glenn says, they'll focus on biodiversity net gain because of its planning connotations will be another thing.
Is there anyone from National Trust in the room? I'm just going to say, please put your hand up and we'll direct people to you. So we're going to wrap up now, but I thought just one final 10-word answer or whatever, 10-second answer, I'm taking up all the time, of the question was what do farmers need to know with BNG? Like, what's the one thing you think, okay, if you're going in, this is what you need to know? Sophia.
Nothing, just come to your experts. Or Glenn.
It's know your land, I think, is the first and most fundamental point. If you don't know the land you're dealing with, then this isn't for you.
It's not going to be a windfall, but it can support financial and, of course, crucially, ecological resilience, and collaborate, reach out to others.
Yeah, I'd say don't try and put a square peg in a round hole. If it's not for you, then you should know that, and don't try and force the issue. But I'd also say, do what's right for nature. Don't chase the money. I think there's a temptation there to try and get the most number of units to put the habitat in place that kind of delivers that. Just do the right thing for nature, and you'll probably find that the money will follow.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much to the wonderful panel. They're going to be here if you've got more questions. I know you do. Sorry if we didn't get to you, but thank you very much. Thanks.